Hello and good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you're seeing this. This is part 2 to Shadow of the Swastika, the reason for the conspiracy behind hemp illegalization in America, and why we should be trying to get it back legalized so we can stop the oil companies' takeover. I'm going to pick up where I left off. I'm going to start about a paragraph back to the introduction. And I'm going to try to get through this in 10 minutes. The introduction. To clearly understand the circumstances which existed during the 1930s and 40s and are subject to this booklet, it would be helpful to first put the hemp petrochemical conflict into historical perspective. The events which took place in the years leading up to World War II were a continuation of a struggle between the agricultural and industrial interests that began before the American Revolution. A struggle which has yet to be decided even today, in 2008. Agriculture versus industry. The historical record, at least as it has been presented to us in the public school system, is that the Civil War was fought to end slavery. This is not the whole story. The truth of the matter is that it was also a clash between the northern industrialists and the southern agriculturalists over control and expansion of the newly opened West. In 1845, Abraham Lincoln wrote, "I hold it a paramount duty of us in the free state to do to the union of the states, and perhaps to liberty itself, to let the slavery and other states alone." Concerning the western territories, he said, "The whole nation is interested that the best use shall be made of these territories. We want them for homes and free white people. This they cannot be to any considerable extent, if slavery be planted within them." Lincoln was caught in the middle between the northern industrialists and the southern agriculturalists, who both wanted to dominate the western expansion because of the wealth it offered. The industrialists knew that the agricultural depended on slavery because cotton, upon which the southern wealth was based, was very laborious intensive and required inexpensive labor that slavery provided. They knew that if the western lands were declared free states, then the southern agriculturists would then be unable to compete and would be forced to leave western expansion and its potential profits to the northern industrialists. Quoting The Irony of Democracy by Thomas R. Dye and T. Harmon Ziegler, the importance of the Civil War for the America's elite structure was the commanding position that the new industrialist capitalists won during the course of the struggle. The economist transformation of the United States from an agricultural to an industrial nation reached the crescendo of a revolution in the second half of the 19th century. As he said, Civil War profits compounded the capital of the industrialists and placed them in a position to dominate the economic life of a nation. Moreover, when the southern planters were removed from the national scene, the government in Washington became the exclusive domain of the new industrial leaders. The northern industrialists used this increased capital to build a system of transcontinental railways, linking the northeast with both the south and the west. The labor for this undertaking was from the northeastern establishment's own source of cheap labor, recently freed slaves, and poor immigrants from Europe and China, who suffered under living conditions which were often little better than those which existed under the slave system just a few years before. It was during the years between the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century that the northern industrialists altered the role of the American government, originally established by the Revolution to protect and preserve the lives, property, and freedoms of all Americans from repressive government. It was transformed into an agency to protect the economic future of northern industrialists. The industrial elites, according to Dye and Ziegler, saw no obligation to legislation if it furthered their success in business. Unrestricted competition might prove who was the fittest, but as an added precaution to ensure that the industrialist capitalists themselves emerged as the fittest, those new elitists also insisted upon government subsidies, patents, tariffs, loans, and massive giveaways of land and other natural resources. The struggle between the western farmers and the railroads owned by the northern industrialists is a good example. To protect their interests, citizens created the Grange, an organization which helped to enact state laws regulating the ruthless aggression of the railroads. In 1877, these laws were upheld by the Supreme Court in Munn v. Illinois' decision. But a few years later, Justice Stephen A. Field changed the role and the very definition of the corporation. He gave a new interpretation to the 14th Amendment that actually gave corporations legal status as citizens, as artificial persons, straw men. It was not long after this change in the interpretation of the 14th Amendment that J.D. Rockefeller, the father of modern-day corporation, created the Great Standard Oil Corporation. By the late 1800s, gained control over 90% of all the oil refineries in America. Now you see what's going on. The roots of the 20th century American politics can best be illustrated by the 1896 presidential election won by Republican William McKinley by a landslide. The McKinley campaign was directed by Marcus Alonzo Hanna of Standard Oil and raised a $16 million campaign from the wealthy fellow industrialist, an amount that was unmatched in presidential campaigns until the 1960s. The major theme of the campaign, and one that would echo far into the future, was what's good for business is good for the country. This emerging political and judicial misuse of power in America was feared by Thomas Jefferson, who in 1787 wrote, "I think our government will remain virtuous for many centuries as long as they remain chiefly agricultural, and this will be as long as there shall be vacant lands in any part of America. When they get piled upon one another in large cities as in Europe, they will become corrupt as in Europe." It is important to remember that the American Revolution was a clash between the agriculturists in the colonies and the British industrialists who controlled the government in England. Almost 100 years later, the Civil War was fought as a continuation of the same basic struggle, but with the victory going back to the industrialists. This began the erosion of the American government, of the people, for the people, and by the people. The buying of the 1896 presidential election by Hanna of Standard Oil and the Northern Industrial Interest was the next important step in the long road to American government of the corporation, for the corporation, by the corporation. You notice, we're out of the picture. A few years later, World War I would forge an even closer relationship between corporations and government in the United States, as well as around the world. Anthony Sampson, in his book, The Arms Bazaar, notes that the American companies led by U.S. Steel and DuPont were transformed by war orders. U.S. Steel, which had absorbed Carnegie's old steel company, had made average annual profits in the 4 pre-war years of 105 million, while in the 4-year war they were 240 million, and DuPont average profit went up from 6 million to 58 million. Certainly the arms company had become much richer through the war, and were the widespread suspicion that they were actually trying to prolong it. The bottom line is, of course, victory or profit, in which the proportions. To what lengths would this nation's top industrialist leaders go to secure their shares of the profits before and during the next war to end all wars? That there is the end of the introduction. Notes on the introduction. American Political Tradition by Hofstadter, page 109, as reprinted in The Irony of Democracy. Thomas R. Dye and L. Harmon Ziegler, page 72. American Political Traditions, page 113, as reprinted in the Irony of Democracy, page 72. Irony of Democracy, page 73, in the bids 74, 75, 76, 82, and 62. The Arms Bazaar, Anthony Simpson, page 65. Now you should understand that oil took care of everything that we should have been and not. The next chapter I will deal with will be the U.S. corporations and the Nazis, a link to all this. And you'll find out that this is not what America should be today. These corporations took over, and just like they owned all the media and everything, they owned everything back then. And you wonder why you don't get the news that you should get. Well, until then, be good or be good at it.